Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most fundamental topics in all of biology, evolution. We're going to break this down like a classroom lesson, really focusing on exactly what you need to know, especially for your exams.
So let's start with the biggest question of all. Look around. How did we get everything from tiny little bacteria to massive blue whales? This is the central mystery that the theory of evolution really sets out to answer. So to figure it out, we need a plan.
And here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start at the very, very beginning, the first spark of life. Then we'll jump into Darwin's game-changing idea, look at the proof, and finally we'll wrap it all up with the story of, well, us. All right, first things first, how did life even get started? To answer that, we've got to rewind the clock, way back, about 4 billion years, to a planet Earth that would look totally alien to us today. You know, for a long, long time, people believed in something called spontaneous generation. The idea was that life could just, poof, appear out of nowhere, like flies from rotting meats or frogs from mud. But then the great scientist Louis Pasteur came along and proved that, nope, life only comes from other life. We call this biogenesis. But that created a new puzzle, right? If all life comes from life, where did the very first life come from? Well, the best explanation we have is called chemical evolution. This idea from Oparin-Haldane suggests that the early Earth was like a giant chaotic chemistry set. Think about it, crazy high temperatures, constant volcanic storms, and an atmosphere with no oxygen, but full of stuff like methane and ammonia. They believed that in this primordial soup, simple non-living chemicals could have reacted to form the complex organic molecules needed for life. So, in 1953, two scientists, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, decided to put this idea to the test. It was brilliant, really. They built this contraption that basically recreated that early Earth environment in a glass flask. They zapped it with electric sparks to act like lightning, and they waited. And you know what? It worked. They found amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. This was huge. It was the first real evidence that you could go from non-living chemicals to the stuff of life. Okay. Pay close attention here. This is important for NEET. A question can definitely be asked from this part.
So here's how they might test you. The Miller-Urey experiment is a classic exam topic. They love to ask about the specific gases used in that simulated atmosphere. The key thing you have to remember is what wasn't there: oxygen. The atmosphere was what we call reducing. So the correct answer is that mixture of methane, hydrogen, ammonia, and water vapor.
Okay, so now we have life. But how did it get so incredibly diverse? Well, this is where a guy named Charles Darwin sails into our story. Darwin came up with this beautiful and powerful idea he called natural selection. And it really boils down to a few simple points. First, in any group of animals or plants, there's variation. Everyone's a little bit different. Second, there's a struggle for survival because resources are limited. Now, because of this, the individuals that happen to have traits that give them an edge are more likely to survive, have babies, and pass on those winning traits. And that's the core idea of fitness. It's not about being the strongest, it's about who's best at leaving more offspring. That's reproductive fitness. Now, it's super important not to get Darwin's idea mixed up with Lamarck's. Lamarck thought that if a giraffe stretched its neck its whole life to reach tall trees, its kids would be born with longer necks. He thought you could pass on traits you acquired. Darwin's idea was completely different. He said the variation was already there. Some giraffes were just born with slightly longer necks by chance, and those were the ones that could eat better, survive, and have more long-necked babies. See the difference? Get ready, because this comparison is a classic exam question. This is definitely important for NEET.
Survival of the fittest. This phrase trips up so many people. What does fittest actually mean to an evolutionary biologist? It's not about being the strongest or the fastest. In Darwin's world, fitness is all about one thing: reproductive success. So the correct answer is leaving more progeny, more offspring than others. That's it.
So what's the actual proof for all this? Well, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming, and it comes from all sorts of different places, from fossils to DNA. One of the coolest lines of evidence comes from comparing the bodies of different animals. Take a look at this chart. On one hand, you have homologous structures. Think about your arm, a whale's flipper, and a bat's wing. They do different things, right? But if you look at the bones, the underlying structure is the same. That points to a common ancestor. We call that divergent evolution. On the other hand, you have analogous structures, like the wing of a butterfly and the wing of a bird. They do the same job, flying, but they evolved completely separately. That's a great example of convergent evolution.
And we can actually see natural selection happen right before our eyes. The peppered moth in England is the textbook case study. Before the Industrial Revolution, trees were covered in light-colored lichen, so light-colored moths were perfectly camouflaged. But then factories started pumping out soot that turned the trees black. All of a sudden, the dark moths had the advantage because birds couldn't see them as easily. And what happened? The population of dark moths soared. It's a perfect, real-life example of evolution in action. Let's focus up. You will absolutely see questions about homologous and analogous structures, so let's practice. Okay, let's think this through. A bat's wing is for flying. A whale's flipper is for swimming, so they have very different functions. But what about their structure? If you look at the bones inside, they share that same fundamental pattern from a common mammalian ancestor. Since they have a similar structure from a common origin but different functions, that makes them homologous structures. All right, we've talked about the what. Now let's get into the how. What are the actual processes, the engines, that drive evolutionary change in a population? So, scientists have a model called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. It basically describes a population that is not evolving, it's staying perfectly stable. So, by definition, evolution is anything that messes with that stability. And there are 5 main things that do that. You've got gene flow, which is just individuals moving in or out of a population. There's genetic drift. This is pure chance, like a few insects randomly getting squished. Then you have mutation, which creates brand new variations. Genetic recombination shuffles existing genes around. And of course, there's natural selection, the one we've been talking about, where nature selects the best adapted individuals. And for our final chapter, let's turn the camera around and look at ourselves. Let's trace the incredible journey of human evolution. Our family tree goes way, way back. But this chart gives us a nice snapshot of our more recent ancestors. As you look down the list, from Australopithecines to Homo habilis, the handyman, then to Homo erectus and the Neanderthals, one trend just jumps out at you. Look at that brain capacity. Over millions of years, there was this steady, dramatic increase in the size of the brain. And that bigger brain allowed for everything from better tools to complex social groups and even art. Okay, final exam tip. This is absolutely important for NEET. The sequence of human ancestors and their approximate brain sizes is a super high-yield topic. You'll want to have this timeline memorized. And that pretty much brings us to the end of our lesson. We've gone from the very first spark of life all the way to modern humans. The big thing to remember is that evolution isn't just something that happened in the past. It's an ongoing process, which leaves us with one last thing to think about. Where do we go from here?